The sound had been following me for maybe the last half hour, and what finally got under my skin wasn't the branch snapping behind me. It was that every time I turned to check, the woods went completely still, like something had decided it was done making mistakes for a minute. I was standing at a rocky overlook with my phone in one hand and my trekking pole strap wrapped around my wrist, looking down into this narrow fold of trees where the light was already starting to flatten out. The sky was still clear. You could see forever from parts of Black Balsam that day. It wasn't storming. It wasn't getting dark yet. There wasn't any obvious reason for me to feel the way I did. I remember hearing my own breathing more than anything. Dry, a little too fast, louder inside my chest than it should have been. And I kept thinking the same thing over and over. If somebody's been this close to me the whole time, why haven't I seen them once? I do a lot of solo hiking, or I guess I should say, I did a lot more of it before this happened. Back then, I was training for one of those long endurance hiking events where you cover a stupid amount of miles in one push just to prove to yourself you can. I liked training alone because it let me keep my own pace, and honestly, because I like being by myself outside. I always have. I wasn't one of those people who spent a whole hike glancing over their shoulder every 5 minutes or getting nervous the second they lost cell service. If anything, being alone usually made me settle in faster. That was part of the routine for me. Weekday hikes, earlier starts, fewer people. I'd pack light but not carelessly. Water filter, first aid kit, headlamp, even if I didn't plan to use it, extra socks in a freezer bag, the same cheap salted cashews I always brought because they didn't turn to dust at the bottom of my pack. I tracked miles, elevation gain, splits, all of that. If a trail was quiet, that was a plus. That morning, I drove out before sunrise from where I was staying and got to the Black Balsam area while there was still that bluish color on everything. The air had that dry mountain chill that makes your nose sting a little when you breathe in. Perfect weather for a long loop. No rain in the forecast, visibility for miles, just enough breeze up on the ridges to keep the sweat from sticking. I was expecting an easy training day, 11 miles total, back at the car with enough daylight left to grab something greasy on the drive home and feel like I'd earned it. I'd hiked that general section twice before. Same spur trail too, little used, not completely hidden, but easy enough to skip if you didn't know it was there. Most people stuck to the more obvious routes near the balds and overlooks. On my earlier trips, I think I saw maybe 4 people combined. So when I started that morning, and the parking area only had a few vehicles, none of that registered as unusual. It was exactly why I'd picked that day. The first few miles were normal, in a way that now almost annoys me to think about. The trail was dry. My boots were throwing up that powdery dirt that settles on your laces. I passed one spot where the path opened up, and the wind came across the ridge hard enough to push cool air down through my shirt. I stopped once to tighten the tape on the handle of one of my poles because it had started peeling again. I took a couple of pictures I never kept. Nothing memorable. At the first overlook, I stepped off to the side to drink some water and looked down out of habit, mostly because I pay attention to trail conditions. That's when I noticed the footprints. Not just prints in general. Fresh boot prints crossing over mine. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the dirt like it was going to explain itself. I knew they were over mine, because one of my own prints had this weird drag line off the heel from where I'd slipped a little on loose gravel earlier. I remembered making it. The other print cut right across it, clean edges. Recent. But that didn't bother me much at first. It made sense, actually. Somebody had probably taken the loop in the opposite direction and hit the overlook after I moved through. I hadn't heard them, but the mountain wind carries weird. Sound disappears. People step off the trail to use the bathroom or take pictures. It's easy to miss somebody if timing lines up wrong. I remember literally shrugging to myself and taking another sip of water. Then I kept moving. And the thing that started bothering me wasn't one big moment. It was repetition. Every overlook after that, already had fresh footprints. That was the part I couldn't place. I wasn't on some wide, busy route where people were constantly leapfrogging each other. This was a little-used spur trail almost 4 miles from the nearest trailhead. I should have passed someone eventually if they were moving opposite me, or they should have shown up behind me when the trail narrowed. Instead, I kept reaching these open spots, these little places where a person would have had to stand at least a minute to look out over the valley, and there were recent boot marks there like somebody had just been waiting and then left right before I arrived. I told myself it was probably more than one hiker. That was the easiest explanation. A couple of people who'd started earlier. Somebody is trail running. Maybe even someone cutting between side paths I hadn't noticed on previous hikes. I held on to that one longer than I probably should have. Around midday, I stopped near a cluster of scrubby trees where the trail bent out of the wind. I wanted to take a picture across one of the ridges and check my route on my phone. I leaned one trekking pole against a tree trunk while I did it, because I hate trying to hold everything at once, and I stood there maybe 30 seconds, not longer. I could smell warm pine bark, and that dry, dusty plant smell you get when the sun's been on the same slope for hours. Everything looked normal, quiet. When I turned back around, my pole was gone from where I'd left it. Not missing, just moved. It was lying several feet away in the grass and rock, not rolled downhill, not blown by wind, just set down on a flat patch like somebody had picked it up and put it there. I remember staring at it and then looking up automatically, not because I thought I was in danger yet, but because it made no sense. The breeze wasn't strong enough. It hadn't fallen in a way that would have taken it there, and if it had slipped, the angle was wrong. It would have rolled down toward the trail, not sideways. I walked over, picked it up, and the handle felt warm from the sun. I actually said out loud, "Okay." Just that, like I was answering somebody. Then I laughed a little, but it sounded forced even to me. I told myself I must have said it there without paying attention. That happens when you're tired. You do things automatically and remember them differently later. I was training hard back then. I'd started early. Maybe I was a little dehydrated. Maybe I was thinking ahead to the rest of the loop and wasn't paying close attention. The problem was, I knew I hadn't said it there. That was the first moment when the hike stopped feeling like a workout and started feeling like a situation I needed to manage. I didn't turn around then. I should make that clear. A lot of people hear this story and ask why I kept going. The answer is that nothing had happened that was enough by itself. Footprints can be explained. A moved pole can be explained if you're willing to doubt yourself a little. And I was willing to doubt myself a lot before I was willing to believe somebody was out there messing with me for no reason. So I kept hiking, but I got more deliberate. I started checking behind me at bends. I listened to my own steps. I stopped taking pictures. I shortened my breaks to almost nothing. My pace got a little faster without me deciding it should. That's when I noticed the branch snaps. Every time I stopped walking, somewhere behind me, not close enough to pin down exactly, I'd hear a single crack, just one. Dry wood under weight, then nothing. No follow-up footsteps, no voices, no brush moving. Just silence so complete, it made the snap feel intentional. The first time, I thought deer. There are always deer. They freeze when you freeze, then move when you move. Easy. The second time, I thought maybe another hiker was doing the same thing I was doing, stopping when they heard me stop because they didn't want to startle me. By maybe the fourth or fifth time, I couldn't make those explanations sit right anymore, because it wasn't random. I'd walk for a while, hear only the scrape of gravel under my boots and the little clicking sound my pack chest strap buckle made if I hit the ground too hard. Then I'd stop, sometimes in the middle of nowhere just to test it, and after a second or two, there'd be that same clean branch snap from somewhere back along the trail or just off it. It got to where I started changing how I moved because of it. I stopped less often. When I did stop, I kept one foot shifting a little, so whoever it was, if it was someone, wouldn't get the clean silence cue as easily. I started pretending to drink water, without taking my eyes off the trail behind me. I looked into the trees more than I looked at the ground, which is how you know I wasn't comfortable anymore, because I usually watch my footing out there. That's training. Ankles go faster than bravado. I remember one section in particular, where the trail narrowed between rhododendron and young pines, and the light turned green and dim under the branches. It was warmer there, no wind, and I could smell damp leaves even though most of the day had been dry. I could hear a woodpecker somewhere off to my right, then not hear it anymore, and that silence felt louder than the bird had. I stopped, because I thought I heard breathing, not heavy breathing, just that soft shift of air like somebody trying not to breathe through their mouth. Nothing happened, for maybe 5 seconds. Then the branch snapped. I kept walking before I even consciously decided to. I know how that sounds, that I should have called out or announced myself or something. But the feeling I had by then wasn't that I was sharing the trail with somebody awkward. It was that somebody was choosing not to be seen. And once you start thinking that, you don't really want to invite conversation. The late afternoon light started changing on me by then. Not dark, just lower, warmer, throwing longer shadows between the trees. I'd planned to finish the full loop, and technically I still had plenty of time. But my brain had split into 2 tracks. One was still doing normal trail math, distance left, elevation, where the final ridge would open up, and how long it should take to reach the junction back toward the parking area. The other was watching everything, every overlook, every bend, every patch of disturbed dirt, and I kept seeing signs without ever getting the person. Fresh prints, where there shouldn't have been any. A place in the trail edge where the dirt looked scuffed, like somebody had stepped off, just before I came around. Once, a little crushed stem of grass was still trying to lift back up. Nothing that would mean much to anybody else. But when you're alone for miles, and the same pattern keeps repeating, tiny things start feeling heavy. I tried to reason it through. Maybe somebody was avoiding me because they were nervous too. Maybe there was a side trail or game path paralleling sections of the Spurley, and I just didn't know it. Maybe I was building a whole structure out of coincidence because I'd had one weird moment with my trekking pole and couldn't let it go. That would have been my preferred explanation, honestly. That I was being stupid. That I was letting my own nerves make a story out of nothing. What kept getting in the way of that was timing. Every time I stopped moving, something behind me acknowledged it. And the closer I got to the final ridge, the more that felt less like chance and more like communication. By the time I started the gradual climb toward the last exposed section, my hands had that clumsy feeling they get when your body is already ahead of your thoughts. Not shaking exactly, just not working quite right. I fumbled the zipper on the side pocket of my pack twice, trying to put my phone away. My mouth was dry in a way water wasn't fixing. I kept telling myself I was almost at the final ridge, almost to a place with open visibility, and once I got there, I'd probably finally see whoever had been moving around out there, and the whole thing would become embarrassingly normal. I think I needed that to be true. The ridge opened across a narrow valley, another trail visible on the opposite slope through breaks in the trees. The light out there was brighter than where I was standing, and for a second, I remember feeling relief just from seeing farther. Space helps. Open ground helps. It makes you feel less trapped by your own imagination. Then I saw the person. He was standing on the other trail across the valley, maybe not that far in pure distance, but far enough that I couldn't make out his face. Just a figure, upright, perfectly still, facing directly toward me, not turned sideways, not looking at the view, at me. I stopped, so that the loose rock shifted under my boot. He didn't wave, didn't move, didn't pretend to be doing anything else. The whole posture of him was what made my stomach go tight. Most people out on a trail shift their weight, look around, adjust a strap, scratch their neck, something. This person stood like he'd been placed there. I had a small pair of binoculars in my packside pocket. Nothing fancy. I carried them sometimes if I was training in places with long sight lines, because I liked spotting hawks and reading distant trail movement. My hands were so clumsy I nearly dropped them getting them up. The second I raised them toward my face, the figure stepped behind a tree. Not casually, not like somebody resuming a hike, just one smooth movement sideways and gone. I waited for him to come out the other side. He didn't. I moved a few feet to change my angle. Nothing. I watched that stretch of the opposite trail long enough that my eyes started watering from not blinking right. No movement, no shape between the trunks, no sound carrying back, and I realized something that bothered me almost more than seeing him had. He'd moved only when I tried to get a better look. That was it for me. I didn't finish the loop. I didn't stand there and think it over. I turned around and started back the way I'd come. Fast enough that it probably would have looked like trail running if anyone had seen me, which nobody did. I didn't stop at overlooks. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to take my pack off. I kept both poles in my hands and moved as quickly as I trusted myself to move, without blowing out an ankle. The air felt colder going back, even though it probably wasn't. I could hear my own gear shifting with every step. Once, on a downhill stretch, one of my poles hit a rock and slipped, and I nearly went down on my knee. I caught myself and kept going. I didn't hear the branch snaps anymore. That somehow made it worse, because either whoever it was had stopped following me, or they hadn't needed to signal their position anymore. The woods started feeling crowded, in a way empty places sometimes do, when you think somebody is using the same space differently than you are. Every tree line became a place somebody could stand without being visible. Every bend ahead felt like something I had to clear and survive, not just walk through. I checked behind me constantly, but not for long, because I was more afraid of what I might see if I actually caught somebody there than I was of not checking. There was one section where the trail crossed open rock simpy, and I remember hoping, stupidly, that I'd see another normal person. Just anybody. A couple with a dog, some guy in a bright shearies, asking for directions. But the place stayed empty. Beautiful and empty. Big sky, long ridges, all of it useless. By the time I got back near the main area, my shoulders were aching from how hard I'd been holding them up, and the inside of my shirt was cold with dried sweat. The parking area came into view through the trees, and I felt that weird half-second of relief before I remembered somebody could have had a car there the whole time, and I'd never know which one. There were a few vehicles left. None of them meant anything to me. I got to mine, unlocked it with my hand shaking just enough that I missed the button the first time, threw my pack in the passenger seat, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. I sat there with the windows up, hearing the tick of cooling metal from the hood, and the soft plastic creak of my steering wheel under my hands. I watched the trailhead for a minute, then another. Nobody came out. I left without changing my boots. I didn't report it, and I still don't know if that was the right call. Report what, exactly? I kept finding signs of somebody and then saw a person across a valley who stepped behind a tree. That's not enough for anything official. That's a bad feeling with some details attached to it. I know that, but I also know I wasn't confused about the footprints. I didn't imagine my trekking pole moved. I didn't invent the branch snags because by the end I was stopping on purpose just to see if they'd happen again. And they did. I never confirmed that anyone was following me. I can't prove it. Maybe there was a harmless explanation sitting right there the whole time, and I was too wound up to see it. I just still can't explain how someone stayed close enough to leave fresh signs of their presence without ever appearing on the same stretch of trail. The next one had a completely different kind of quiet, and that somehow made it worse. I almost stepped on the backpack before I even realized it was there. It was tucked under a few flat rocks near the edge of a dry wash, like somebody had tried to hide it fast without digging or covering it properly. And for a second, I honestly thought I was looking at trash. The sun was right over me by then, the kind of Nevada heat that flattens everything and makes the air above the sandstone look like it's moving, even when it isn't. I had one camera hanging against my chest, another lens wrapped in a t-shirt inside my bag, because I didn't trust the case zipper, and I was already telling myself I needed to head back soon if I wanted decent light for the drive to Las Vegas. But that backpack stopped me, because it wasn't old, it wasn't faded, or half-buried, or chewed up by weather. It looked placed, and when I touched one of the rocks covering it, my phone started ringing where there should barely have been enough signal for a weather app to load. I was in college at the time, and I was doing this landscape photography project that I had turned into something way more complicated than it needed to be. That was kind of my whole personality back then. If an assignment called for 10 decent images, I wanted 20 great ones. And if everybody else was going to the obvious overlook with the nice sunset, I wanted the trail, some forum comment said hardly anyone used, because the rock formations looked better if you were willing to hike farther. That's why I picked that route in the Valley of Fire. Not one of the main scenic stops where tourists were everywhere taking the same picture. A more remote hiking route, farther from the popular areas. The sort of place people recommended with phrases like, "If you're comfortable being out there alone." I wasn't really. That's the funny part. I was not a naturally solo outdoors person. I liked having someone with me, even if we barely talked, just another body in the space. But none of my friends wanted to spend a weekend afternoon in the desert helping me take pictures of stone. So I went by myself. I tried to make myself feel responsible about it. I packed a lot of water, more than I thought I'd need. I downloaded a GPS app and saved the route offline. I texted one friend the trail name and told him I'd send him a picture when I got back to my car, mostly so somebody would know if I disappeared into a sandstone crack and broke an ankle like an idiot. I wore a hat I hated because it made me look like I was trying too hard. And I brought store-brand granola bars that turned soft in the heat. I did all the practical things people say to do when you're hiking alone, in a place that can absolutely punish stupid mistakes. The trail itself was beautiful, in a way that almost doesn't look real at first. Layers of red and orange stone, dry washes, weird shapes cut into the rock like melted architecture. The sky was huge, too huge, honestly. I know some people love that open feeling, but when you're out there alone, it can make you feel very small in kind of an exposed way. Like if something goes wrong, there's nowhere to tuck yourself. No tree cover, no shade except what the rock gives you. No one nearby unless they're close enough to already be a problem. Still, the first part of the hike was fine, better than fine. I got a bunch of shots I was happy with. Long shadows along a ridgeline. One narrow section where the sandstone folded up in layers that looked almost purple underneath. I spent longer than I should have messing with aperture settings while sweat ran down my back and collected under my camera strap. I remember feeling proud of myself for doing it alone. Not relaxed exactly, but functional. Like maybe I was becoming one of those people who could enjoy this kind of thing without needing a buddy. I saw very few other people. A couple in the distance early on. Nowhere near my route, and then nobody, which had been the point. After a while, I dropped into this dry wash area where the ground changed from rock to loose sand and little patches of scrub. It was quieter there because the wind didn't hit as hard. You could hear small sounds better. Pebbles shifting under your shoes, fabric rubbing when you move your arm. My own breathing had that dry edge from being hot and not wanting to waste water by drinking too fast. That's where I found the backpack. It was partly visible beneath a few pale rocks, stacked just enough to be deliberate, but not enough to really conceal it. Dark fabric, one strap looped out. It looked wrong in the landscape, not forgotten so much as put aside. My first thought was simple. Somebody stashed it to lighten a climb. People do that. They dump extra weight, scramble up something, and come back later. Maybe it had water in it. Maybe camera gear. Maybe somebody didn't want to drag it through a narrow section and had some system I didn't understand. I should have just kept walking. Instead, I crouched down near it, not even because I planned to open it, but more because I was trying to see if there was a tag or something that would tell me how fresh it was. The rock under my hand was hot enough that I pulled my fingers back quickly. My camera knocked against my chest when I bent. Then my phone started ringing. That alone should not have been scary. Phones ring. But out there, I had almost no signal. My GPS worked because I downloaded the route. Texts were coming in late, if they came in at all. I hadn't had enough service to check anything in a while, so hearing my phone vibrate and ring in that empty wash made my whole body jerk a little before my brain caught up. Unknown number. I let it ring. It stopped, then started again maybe 10 seconds later. Same unknown number. I stood up, turned in a slow circle, like that would help me understand where a phone call could even be coming from, and answered on the third try with a weird defensive hello that sounded too loud in the open air. Nothing, or maybe not nothing. There might have been a faint rustling sound, but it could have been the connection, could have been wind, could have been me moving the phone against my cheek. Then the call dropped. I looked at my signal, and it was barely there. One inconsistent bar flickering in and out. I remember actually laughing once, nervous and annoyed. I thought maybe spam calls had finally reached the desert. Maybe some robocaller got lucky at exactly the wrong time. I put the phone back in my pocket and told myself not to be dramatic. I also left the backpack alone. That part feels important. I didn't open it. I didn't unzip anything. I didn't go through someone else's stuff. I just noticed it and moved on. At least I tried to. For the next stretch, I couldn't stop checking behind me. Not because of any solid reason, just because something had shifted. The trail felt less empty in a safe way, and more empty in a vulnerable way. Like being out there alone was no longer peaceful background information. It was the main fact. I started hiking back toward the trailhead side earlier than planned. I still took a few pictures because I was there, and I needed them, but my attention wasn't on the camera anymore. It was on the silence between little gusts of wind and the way sound carried strangely off the rock walls. Once I thought I heard an engine far off, and told myself it had to be from one of the roads in the park. Then the sound disappeared, and Ed and I weren't sure I'd heard it at all. When I got to a higher section where I could see more of the access area in the distance, I noticed a pickup truck slowly entering the trailhead parking area. That shouldn't have meant anything either. People arrive late. People leave late. But I'd been out there long enough that the timing bothered me. The movement was slow, almost cautious. The truck didn't just pull in and park. It kind of eased into the space, stopped, then adjusted. I watched it longer than I needed to. I couldn't make out details from that far. Just a light-colored pickup, moving carefully through a place that had maybe one or two other vehicles. It gave me this stupid, immediate urge to get back faster, without ever fully admitting to myself why. Then my phone rang again. Unknown number. And again. Same number. I didn't answer. I just kept walking, then kept walking faster. The phone buzzing in my pocket felt unreal, like some part of a different life had followed me into the desert where it didn't belong. I checked the signal once and saw almost nothing. That made it worse, not better. If there wasn't really enough service to hold a normal call, why was this one getting through over and over? I tried to reason it out. Somebody at school. A glitch. Delayed calls are all hitting at once because I happened to pass through a stronger patch. That made the most sense, and I clung to it because the alternative required me to think there was some connection between the hidden backpack and the phone calls, and that felt paranoid. The first man appeared near a bend where the trail narrowed between rock walls. He came from ahead, walking toward me, with that casual pace people use when they're trying very hard to look casual. Middle-aged maybe. Ball cap, dusty shirt, breathing a little hard, but not enough to seem actually tired. Normal enough at first glance. He lifted a hand like we were just two hikers passing each other. Then he asked if I'd seen a missing backpack. My whole face went hot. I don't know if he noticed. I hope not. I tried to keep my voice flat when I said something like, "What kind of backpack?" He described a dark bag, medium-sized, nothing distinctive, in a way that told me either it wasn't really his, or he expected me to fill in the blanks for him. I said I'd seen some gear off trail earlier, and pointed back generally toward the wash without being too specific. He didn't thank me right away. He just looked past me, over my shoulder, like he was checking whether anyone else was nearby. Then he said, "You open it?" I said no. He smiled, but only with his mouth. Good. That one word sat wrong. I told myself there were harmless explanations. Maybe it had expensive equipment in it. Maybe he was worried somebody had stolen from him. Maybe he and his friend had hidden it and forgotten exactly where. People get strange about their stuff. People also ask clumsy questions. That happens. Still, after we passed each other, I didn't like having my back to him. I kept wanting to look around, but I didn't want to look scared either, even though there was nobody out there to perform calm for except him. I had gone maybe 10 minutes when the second man appeared. Different direction. He came in from off to my left, not exactly from a marked route, more like he had crossed open ground and met the trail on purpose. Younger than the first guy maybe, sunglasses, carrying nothing that I could see. He asked, almost immediately, if I'd seen a missing backpack. Same wording, not similar, same. And that's the moment all the explanations I was trying to hold on to started collapsing at once, because one lost backpack and two different men asking from two different directions could still maybe be normal in a vacuum. Friends searching separately, fine. But the timing, the calls, the hidden way the pack had been covered, the question about whether I'd opened it, all of it together made my body decide before my mind did. My mouth got dry. My hands started feeling too light, like I couldn't trust my grip. I answered him without stopping fully and said I thought I'd seen something back toward the wash and kept moving. He didn't try to block me. He just watched me for a second too long before turning away. That was when I stopped pretending I was just uneasy and admitted to myself I needed to get around other people. The problem was that basically there weren't other people. That route was remote on purpose. The main scenic overlooks were far enough away that they might as well have been in another world. Out where I was, the silence felt enormous. The wind would come through for a minute, hissing over the rock, then die and leave everything so open it almost felt like standing on a stage with no audience. I started moving fast enough that my camera bounced painfully against my chest. Sweat kept getting into my eyes. I could feel heat coming off the stone through the soles of my shoes when I stepped onto flatter sections. I checked my GPS, then checked it again because I was suddenly scared of making a wrong turn, even though the route wasn't complicated. I remember thinking if I twisted an ankle right, then I'd be in real trouble. Not movie trouble, just normal bad real-world trouble where you need people, and there aren't any. I finally saw a maintenance road cutting across a section ahead, and on it, parked crooked near some utility fencing, was a park maintenance vehicle. I don't think I've ever felt relief that hard from seeing an ordinary government truck. A ranger or maintenance worker, I didn't know which yet, was standing near it with one hand on the door, looking down at something clipped to a board. I waved before I was even close enough to talk. Not in a subtle way, in a please notice me way. He did, and the second I reached him, words just started coming out of me too fast. I told him about the backpack, the calls, and the two men, probably not in a clean order. I remember hearing myself sound younger than I wanted to sound, like I was trying not to overreact and failing. He listened, which helped immediately, really listened. He didn't give me that look people give when they think you're feeding off your own nerves. He asked where I'd seen the bag, asked what the truck looked like, asked if I'd touched anything inside the backpack. That question made me stop. Inside. He'd said inside before I had. I told him no, I hadn't opened it, and he nodded in a way I couldn't read. Then he told me to stay near the vehicle while he radioed for another unit. His voice stayed calm, almost boring, which was exactly what I needed. It made everything feel procedural, contained, like I had stepped out of the weirdness and into a system built for dealing with it. I stood near the front of the vehicle, drinking warm water from my bottle, and finally letting my breathing slow down. The metal body of the truck radiated heat back at me. Somewhere behind us, The radio crackled. The ranger kept speaking in short, clipped phrases I couldn't fully make out. I remember noticing stupid details because that's what your mind does when it thinks the danger has passed. A grease mark on the side panel. Dust crusted around the wheel well. The smell of hot engine and sun-baked rubber. I really believed, for maybe 5 full minutes, that it was over. That's the false part of this story. The moment where everything looked like it had resolved cleanly. I had found the right person. I wasn't alone anymore. There was a radio, a vehicle, and an actual employee of the park standing a few feet away. My body started unclenching so fast, I felt almost embarrassed by how scared I'd gotten. Then the pickup truck came down the maintenance road, slowly, not speeding, not dramatic, not trying to ram anything. Just rolling forward with that same deliberate pace I'd seen from a distance earlier, tires crunching over the hard dirt, until it reached a point where it was still well back from us, but close enough that there was no question it was there for this area, and not lost. It stopped. The same light-colored pickup. I couldn't see the faces clearly through the windshield because of glare, but I knew. I knew before the ranger even shifted his stance. The truck just sat there, engine running. Nobody got out. That was what scared me most. If they jumped out yelling or pretending there was some misunderstanding, that at least would have been normal behavior. Instead, they stayed in the cab and watched us. I, specifically, is how it felt. Me standing there next to the maintenance vehicle, suddenly aware of exactly how far open road and desert stretched in every direction. The ranger told me quietly to get behind his truck. I did. I crouched a little near the rear quarter panel without fully hiding, because some part of me thought hiding would make it worse. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in the roof of my mouth. The metal of the truck was hot against my arm through my shirt. I could smell dust and hot brakes and that faint mineral smell the desert gets when the wind changes. Nothing moved except heat shimmer. The pickup stayed where it was. It wasn't a standoff like in a movie. No one shouted, no weapons, no threats I could point to later in some clean legal way. Just waiting. The ranger spoke into his radio again, still calm but shorter now. I couldn't hear the response. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I didn't check it. I kept thinking if they know him, if this is nothing, why are they sitting there like that? Why aren't they coming over? Why aren't they waving this off? Then, way down the road, another parked truck appeared. Just a shape at first, then clearer, moving toward us in a slow plume of pale dust. The pickup in front of us idled another few seconds, then backed up slightly, turned, and drove off without anybody ever stepping out. That silence after it left felt almost stranger than the truck itself. The second ranger arrived, spoke with the first one off to the side for a minute, both of them keeping their voices low enough that I couldn't catch more than a word here and there. I heard my description of the men repeated, heard one of them mention the wash, heard the phrase, same report, or maybe similar report. I can't swear to that part, but it's what I think I heard. They didn't let me hike back alone. There was no question about that. One of them drove me back toward the visitor center, while the other went to recover the backpack. I sat in the passenger seat with my cameras in my lap and watched the rock formations slide by through a dusty windshield. Everything looking normal again, in the worst possible way. Families near scenic pullouts, rental cars, people taking pictures in bright shirts, like they were on a postcard. I felt weirdly disconnected from all of them, as I had come out of a side room they didn't know existed. At the visitor center, they asked me to repeat the story one more time. Same details. Where the backpack was, what the men looked like, how many phone calls. Did I touch the bag? Did I see inside? Again with inside. I asked what was in it, and the ranger who'd first found me just said they were handling it and that I was fine. That was it. No explanation. No follow-up call later. Nothing. I drove back to Las Vegas with both hands tight on the steering wheel, and one camera card full of pictures I still haven't really looked at much. I submitted the project. I got a good grade. I cropped one image 3 different ways because I couldn't decide which version felt less empty. What stays with me isn't just that 2 men seemed very interested in whether I'd found that backpack. It's the way the rangers asked the same question immediately, quietly, like they already knew what mattered about it wasn't the bag itself, but whether I'd touched whatever was inside. They never told me what they recovered, and maybe that's standard. Maybe it means nothing. But I still think about how fast the first ranger asked that, and how unsurprised he seemed by the whole situation. And sometimes I wonder how many hikers found similar hidden caches before me, looked under a few rocks because they were curious, and didn't get a second ranger appearing in the distance when they needed one. The last one is the one that feels the most ordinary right up until it doesn't. He asked me if I'd seen anyone else ahead on the trail, and there was nothing about the question itself that should have stuck with me. We were both standing in morning shade, maybe 15 minutes after sunrise, with that cold, damp smell you get in Pennsylvania woods before the day warms up. I had my usual coffee in a travel mug back at the truck. My knee was feeling decent for once, and he just sounded like a guy trying to locate a hiking partner. So I told him no. If I'd known I was going to end up waist-deep in freezing creek water because of that same man less than an hour later, I would have turned around right there. I started hiking every Sunday morning after I finished physical therapy for knee surgery. That was my deal with myself. I was in my 40s. I had spent long enough being frustrated and stiff and careful about stairs. And once the therapist finally stopped giving me the look that meant, "Don't be stupid," I wanted a routine that made me feel like my body belonged to me again. Nothing extreme. Not mountain races. Not 14-mile death marches. Just consistency. Heart's Content became one of my regular spots because the loop there was manageable. Enough distance to feel like exercise. Enough roots and uneven ground to make the knee work honestly, but not so punishing that I'd spend the next 2 days regretting it. Sunday mornings were best because if I got there shortly after sunrise, the place was usually quiet in a good way. A couple of birders sometimes. Maybe another hiker or 2 near the lot. Then just the woods waking up. I liked that routine more than I can explain. Same old trail shoes, same small backpack, same thermos of coffee from the machine in my kitchen that always made it too strong. I kept a compression sleeve in the truck in case the knee felt unstable, though by then, I mostly didn't need it. Recovery gives you this habit of monitoring yourself. You notice things, where stiffness starts, which downhill grades make you shorten your stride without thinking, the little click in a joint that means nothing, and the different kind that means take it easy. So even though I usually hiked alone, I wasn't uneasy about it. I was paying attention, sure, but in a practical way. That's different from being nervous. That morning was cool enough that my breath showed a little when I first got out of the truck. The parking area had a few vehicles, not many. More than if I'd been there on a weekday, fewer than later in the day when families would start showing up. I remember flexing my leg once beside the tailgate and feeling that mild tightness around the scar that I always got for the first few minutes. No pain, just a reminder. The trail started easily. Soft ground in places, damp leaves, the smell of earth and old wood. You could hear birds well that morning, more than the wind. There was one section where the path curved through taller trees, and everything had that washed gray-green look before the full sun got under the canopy. I felt good. Better than good. Strong, actually. The kind of strong that made me think maybe I'd increase the loop length the following week. I saw the man maybe 20 minutes in. He was coming toward me on the trail, not in a rush, maybe around my age or a little younger. Clean enough, normal enough, nothing wild-looking or obviously wrong. He smiled when we got close, in the automatic way people do outdoors. Then he asked if I'd seen anyone else ahead. I said no, I hadn't. He said something like, "Thought I lost track of somebody," and gave this small laugh, like he was making fun of himself for being disorganized. I asked if he needed me to keep an eye out. No, he said no. No. He was sure it was fine. That should have been the end of it. I kept walking, and for the next 10 or 15 minutes it was. I heard another couple somewhere off trail or on a nearby section, just voices carrying. And once I passed a woman near a wider part of the loop with binoculars around her neck who nodded and kept moving. That's what I mean by exposed. Other people were around that morning, at least here and there. The place wasn't deserted. If you described it on paper, you'd say there was no reason to feel trapped. What I learned is that nearby people and available help are not the same thing. I remember the first odd feeling because it came before the first odd sight. I rounded a bend and had that faint sensation of having missed something. Not a sound exactly, more like the woods had just gone back to normal after a small interruption. Then, maybe 15 minutes after I'd passed him, I saw the same man ahead of me on the trail. That took a second to make sense. He was walking slowly, just far enough in front that I couldn't immediately call out without sounding strange. My first thought was that there must be a side path, or that I'd somehow mistaken another hiker for him. But when he turned half around and lifted a hand in the same easy gesture as before, I knew it was him. He shouldn't have been ahead of me. There were no intersecting routes on that stretch, at least none I knew about, and I knew that loop pretty well by then. He definitely had not passed me. My knee wasn't what it used to be before surgery, but I still would have noticed a man overtaking me on that trail. There aren't that many places to do it without brushing right by someone. I caught up enough that we could talk without raising our voices. He said, "Still just you out here?" I laughed a little because I didn't know what else to do. "Guess so." Then he asked if my vehicle was the only one left in the parking lot. That was when something inside me shifted, not into panic, not yet, more into alertness, because the first question about whether I'd seen anyone ahead, fine. A separated partner, a friend who went off pace. But asking whether my vehicle was the only one in the lot was different. That wasn't about the trail. That was about leaving. I said I hadn't paid much attention, which wasn't exactly true. I'd noticed several vehicles. I always do, mostly because I like having some rough sense of how crowded a place is. But I didn't want to hand him information, and I didn't know why I felt that so clearly all at once. He smiled again, though this time it seemed like a smile used to smooth over the fact he'd asked something he shouldn't have. Then he said, maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe he just needed coffee, and stepped aside like he was going to let me pass. I did pass him, and once I had, I became very aware of my knee. Not because it hurt, because I started calculating with it. How fast could I comfortably move if I needed to? How much downhill I could handle without losing footing? Whether running would be worse than a hard, fast walk? That kind of thinking would have embarrassed me if nothing else had happened. I would have told myself I was being unfair to some harmless guy who happened to be socially awkward. Then, I rounded the next few turns and didn't see him behind me. That should have been good. Instead, it made me feel watched. I kept going. The trail dipped through thicker trees toward the creek crossing, which I knew was coming. That bridge was one of the landmarks I always used on that loop, wooden footbridge over a steep creek. Not huge, but awkward enough that if the boards were slick, you paid attention. Nothing dramatic, just one of those fixed points on a trail you get familiar with if you've hiked it enough. I heard people somewhere off in the distance again, a laugh maybe, then nothing. Morning sounds, birds, water farther ahead. I told myself to stop building a problem. The most reasonable explanation was still that there was some informal cut-through or side route I didn't know. That was genuinely possible. People make paths all the time. He could have taken one, gotten ahead, asked a weird question, and now I was turning it into a story, because being alone makes your brain fill space. I held on to that until I saw where he was waiting. The trail came down toward the bridge through a stand of trees where the ground fell away sharply on either side. You couldn't see the whole crossing until you were almost on it. I remember noticing the smell first, cold creek water and wet wood, and feeling the temperature drop a little in that shaded section. Then I saw him off to the side of the marked trail, not on it, beside it. He'd left the path entirely and was standing among the trees near the approach to the bridge, quiet and still, watching. There was no reason for him to be there, not if he was hiking, not if he was birding, not if he was waiting on a friend. He'd positioned himself at the only bridge crossing that part of the steep creek. The trail narrowed right into it. You either crossed there or you made a much harder choice. I slowed without meaning to. My hands started tingling. That cold, numb feeling crept into my fingers first, before I would have called what I felt fear. My mouth went dry. I could hear the creek more clearly than anything else all of a sudden, water knocking against rocks below. He stepped onto the bridge, not crossing it, into the center. And then he smiled. That's the part I still see when I think about it, because it wasn't friendly anymore. Not nervous, not conversational, not "this man is bad at small talk" awkward. It looked like a person who had stopped pretending there was any other reason for what he was doing. He didn't say a word, just stood there in the middle of the bridge, one hand low by his side, shoulders relaxed, waiting for me to decide what I was going to do. This was still fairly early in the whole encounter, which is why it hit so hard. There hadn't been time for me to fully acclimate to danger. One minute I was on my normal Sunday morning loop thinking about whether my knee felt strong enough to add mileage next weekend. And the next, I was looking at a stranger blocking the only easy crossing on purpose. I didn't stop to negotiate. Maybe that saved me. The bank beside the trail dropped down toward the creek at a steep angle, muddy in spots, full of roots and loose stone. Under any normal circumstances with a knee that had been surgically repaired, I would have avoided that descent without question. Bad footing, bad angle, stupid risk. But I remember looking at the bridge, looking at him, and feeling this absolute certainty that whatever happened to my leg going down that embankment would be easier to survive than stepping onto the boards with him. So I cut off the trail. I half slid, half climbed down the bank, grabbing saplings and exposed roots hard enough to rip bark under my fingers. Dirt filled one of my shoes almost immediately. My bad leg twisted once and sent this hot, sharp warning through the side of my knee that made me think, not now, not now, not now. I heard him move above me, not fast. That was the worst part. No panic from him, no surprise, just movement. The creek water hit me like a punch. It was freezing, not cold in the casual way people say cold. Freezing enough that my legs locked for a second at the shock of it. The current wasn't violent, but the rocks were slick and uneven, and every step sent water up inside my pants. I nearly went down when my foot slipped between two stones. I caught myself with one hand, and the water bit into my palm so hard it felt like pain. I didn't look up at the bridge. I refused to. I could hear the wood creak once above me, then nothing over the water. I pushed across as fast as I could, stumbling more than wading, every movement clumsy because the cold had wrecked my balance, and my knee was screaming now in that deep internal way that tells you might have done something real to it. I grabbed a brush on the far bank and hauled myself up through mud and dead leaves, using both hands, breathing loudly and ugly. Only when I reached the top did I risk looking back. The bridge was empty. Or I thought it was for one terrible second, until I saw him near the opposite approach, partly obscured by trees, not following me into the creek, not calling after me, just standing there watching. That might have been enough to lock me up if the parking lot hadn't been closer in that direction. I turned and started moving, not running exactly. My knee wouldn't have handled a real run by then, more like a limping fast scramble. Downhill where I could, hands out a little for balance, branches slapping my shoulders. I passed two people during that stretch, an older couple with walking sticks, and I remember wanting to stop them, to say something. But what? That man is behind me, and I think he wants something badly. That was true, but it wasn't usable. Also, I didn't want to slow down long enough to explain. That's what I mean about exposed not helping. Other people were around, but not in a way that created safety. They were just more bodies, moving through their own mornings. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me. I kept expecting him to call out in that same friendly voice and make the whole thing sound like I was overreacting. But the woods behind me stayed full of ordinary sounds. Birds, leaves, one sea, the distant slam of a car door from the parking area. That sound gave me more relief than I can explain. When I got back to the lot, I saw immediately that his vehicle was gone. I don't know how long it had been gone. Maybe it left while I was in the creek. Maybe there had been another exit I wasn't thinking about. Maybe he hadn't even parked where I had assumed. But the car I'd vaguely associated with him from earlier, the one I thought might be his, wasn't there anymore. I got to my truck soaked from the waist down, shoes squelching, mud on both hands, and climbed in so fast I banged my shin on the doorframe. I locked the doors before I did anything else. Sat there dripping onto the seat cover with my chest heaving, and the smell of creek water and wet dirt filling the cab. There were other people in the lot, a family unloading a cooler, a man tying his boot, a woman brushing dog hair off the back of her pants. Normal scenes. It would have looked ridiculous from the outside, me sitting there drenched and pale and staring in every mirror. I drove out without changing, and by the time I hit the main road, my hands had started shaking hard enough that I had to pull over and breathe for a minute. The knee swelled later, not badly enough for another surgery, thankfully, but enough that I spent the rest of that Sunday with an ice pack on it, feeling stupid and furious and oddly ashamed, like I'd failed some test of composure. By the next week, the practical part of me had taken back over. I reported what happened to the local office. I described it as best I could. I even went back over the route map to see if there was any legitimate way he could have gotten ahead of me more than once. I never found one. That's the piece that won't sit still in my head. If there had been a side route, fine. If somebody showed me a cutoff I missed, an old service path, anything, I could file the whole thing under a real explanation and let it rot there. But the loop I knew had no intersecting routes that made sense of it, and he never passed me on the trail. So if he really had been hiking alone that morning, I still don't know how he kept getting ahead of me on a trail with nowhere to go except the bridge where he was already waiting.